Good afternoon. Does it work?
Just once, and then when I stop.
It does work? Do you listen to me? Yes, the moderators. Yes, the moderators are taking place. Still we are waiting. Our moderator. Is it working? Okay, we shall start then. We have translation on the various. Cécile, est-ce que les canaux de translation fonctionnent? Parce que je vois une ou deux personnes. Yeah. Do you know what are the various channels? I think it's channel 1 is the natural one, and channel 2 will be French probably, or English.
C'est français.
C'est français.
C'est espagnol.
Espagnol, voilà. Ok, perfect. Vous parlez en français, madame? Oui, moi je parle en français aussi. Donc, oui. J'espère bien, oui.
Répondre aux questions en anglais après.
Voilà, exactement. Ok, let's start. Commençons si vous voulez bien.
Let's start so that we don't get late. I am François Rivassol, new ambassador of France to the United Nations and WTO. And I must offer the most sincere regrets of the Secretary of State, Mr. Lemoine, who last night at the last minute was asked by the government to go to a major ceremony in Africa where he is to represent the Minister of State, who was supposed to have gone but was unable to, and therefore Mr. Lemoine had to change his plans at the very last second, and he apologizes for that. He hopes he'll be back in Geneva soon. But in the meantime, we've got this Franco-Canadian seminar. I thank the Ambassador of Canada for being with me today. This is on trade and climate change, and I'd like to thank each of the panelists who have agreed to participate actively in this seminar. We'll be a bit technical at the outset, but this is the WTO, and this should be nothing strange to you. Now, from a legal point of view, you know, negotiations on international trade and climate change are independent. There's no link between the commitments at international level, but most of the signatories are those who want more positive action between trade and climate change should be moving towards convincing the members of the WTO so to do. That's why we're meeting today. This would be possible if there weren't the possibility of a conflict between give and take and trade policies and the policies on the struggle against climate change, which are intended to face irresistible change. We do hope that there is an opportunity, a very special opportunity, to have greater coordination between these two policies. How can we link these interactions? Three questions for the panelists. How can trade help countries to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement in terms of reduction of emissions, etc.? Should we stay with emission permits? How can we regulate international trade to enable the most vulnerable countries to make the necessary changes and adaptations? Another problem, a basic problem, which I hope could be clarified a wee bit by this seminar: how can countries in their fight against climate change ensure that they do not have a deterioration of their competitiveness, which could lead to measures taken to implement commitments under the Paris Agreement? How can international trade help them in their national efforts to promote the growth of green economies whilst maintaining competitiveness, lowering carbon emissions, delocalizing or moving industry that pollutes? What are the active possibilities here? Clubs, waiver for climatic change or any other solution that might arise. In total, the feasibility of such proposals will depend on economic, legal, and technical parameters, bearing in mind the silo arrangement of climate change on the one hand and commerce and trade on the other, then the restrictive measures in commerce in trade could lead to disputes when linking it to climate change. Should these be dealt with on a case-by-case basis under the dispute settlement body of the WTO? This is one possibility, perhaps not the best to reconcile environmental goals and commerce and trade. We have to deal with how to attack dispute settlement. There's a workshop organized by Canada and France with the help of the International Chamber of Commerce. I would like to thank them for that. This workshop is intended to enable exchanges between political experts, technical experts, climate change experts. You're all here. Thank you for your presence. I hope that the debate will be interactive and a very interesting one. Going beyond this seminar and within the framework of the directives given by ministers, the objective of France and Canada, in cooperation with other partners, will continue to be promote recognition and understanding of the link between trade and climate change in WTO, and the commitment for work on this issue in WTO that will imply exchange with other relevant partners, NGOs, UN agencies, etc. I'll give the floor to the Ambassador of Canada to complete this introduction, and then we'll go to the moderator, who will explain the rules of the game for the exchange for the panelists and for you as well. So thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Thank you very
much.
Today, and what I believe will be a very important and timely discussion. I would like to say and give a grand merci to our colleagues from the French mission to the WTO, led by Jean-Marie Pagom, in organizing today's session. Finally, and not least, I'm very grateful to our distinguished panelists for taking time to join us today. I look forward to your insightful comments and perspectives. The question of how trade can help support the fight against climate change is a very pertinent and relevant question. It's also a topic that's personally very important to me, given my previous experience as Canada's Deputy Chief Climate Change Negotiator. It's gratifying to see that this conversation is gaining increasing profile and traction. That said, we are not where we need to be. We do not, unfortunately, yet have consensus in this House to formally discuss the linkages between trade and climate change. The absence of consensus, however, does not mean inaction. Those countries, like Canada and France, which believe that the time for action is now, are proceeding with implementing national policies aimed at addressing climate change issues. In Canada, this is the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. You'll note that the plan includes a deliberate reference to growth. This is a reflection of Canada's belief that climate change action does not have to come at the expense of economic growth or competitiveness. The opportunities are massive. For example, the global clean tech sector is expected to be worth $3 trillion by 2020. We should all be working to ensure our companies are ready and able to provide the goods and services that will support our collective actions to address climate change. The trade policy sphere must also act. Let me give you a sense of what Canada is doing in this space. We are working with like-minded partners, like France, in our bilateral and regional trade agreements to develop new and cutting-edge approaches to trade and environment issues. In the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, for example, Canada and the EU agreed that their respective trade policies would look to facilitate the removal of obstacles to trade or investment in goods and services of particular relevance for climate change mitigation. CETA also commits both parties to cooperate on trade-related aspects of the current and future international climate change regime, ways to address adverse effects of trade on climate, as well as the means to promote energy efficiency and the development and deployment of low-carbon and other climate-friendly technologies. These bilateral and regional efforts need to be complemented by substantive discussions in this House about how the multilateral trading system should best engage in helping our private sectors realize their full market potential while safeguarding the environment. As I indicated earlier, however, this is not as easy as a task as it should be. Importantly, today's panel shows that we are not alone in this fight and that the push for real and meaningful engagement by WTO members in ensuring that the trading system is climate responsive will continue. Once again, thank you very much to our partner France and to the panelists for their time. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much.
Merci, messieurs les...
Thank you, ambassadors, for your time and your commitment today in the framework of this panel. I'm Nicolas Schulzer. I'm director at the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, ICC, and we do feel very much at home in the framework of the WTO because we're users of the multilateral system, and of course we fully support reform efforts to maintain and strengthen the multilateral system in the WTO framework. Might I begin by introducing the panelists who are with us today? To my extreme left, Mr. Scott Vaughan, Canadian. He's president of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Next to him, Mrs. Claire Toutenuy. Sorry. I didn't put my glasses on, and that will explain that. His Excellency the Ambassador Mark van Herkelen. To the right of Mr. Vaughan, he's permanent representative of the European Union to the WTO, and then Madame Toutenuy, representing Entreprise pour l'Environnement, and she is indeed the general delegate. To my right, the CEO of Natural Cotton, who has come to join us from Brazil.
By asking my first question to Mr. Vaughan. How can we take into account environmental externalities? And we've already heard the two ambassadors referring to competitiveness. So how can we take into account environmental externalities without actually affecting competition? Could you help us to rapidly map the important interactions between trade and climate change? And just some housekeeping rules, if I can ask all panelists to remain brief. I would suggest 5 minutes for each round of questions. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues. Let me begin just by thanking both France and Canada for their leadership on the international climate file. President Macron hosted the One Planet Summit almost a year ago. There was an update of the progress underway at the San Francisco meeting just a few weeks ago. And that's one example of the tremendous and accelerating work that's underway, particularly since the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. And Canada, as we've heard from the ambassador, is an ambitious domestic agenda. Canada also, as an example of the different clubs and coalitions that are emerging very quickly, Canada, China, and the European Commission, for example, are working together on accelerating implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement. I want to begin just by thinking about, why should the WTO think about climate? And to go back to the Marrakesh Agreement, which created the completion of the Uruguay round, creation of the WTO, part of the purpose of this institution is to support, quote, the optimal use of world resources in accordance with the objective of sustainable development. When those words were put into the agreement 20-some years ago, it was more of a normative, what does sustainable development mean? And there's been many debates about sustainable development. That's changed. In 2015, all WTO members have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. One of those goals with SDG 13 is take urgent action to address climate impacts and mitigate build resilience on climate impacts. And so, just as a first observation, I think it's really important for the WTO, through the different committees, agriculture, environment, others, to look at what are the linkages between the implementation of the SDGs and the work underway in WTO. So the ambassador from Canada has said that we're not where we need to be, and I just wanted to take a couple of quick points. So the first is Eric Solheim reminded us this morning that we are now seeing daily the impacts of climate change affecting all around the world. Extreme weather events from prolonged drought disrupting global supply chains and commodities, agriculture, extended forest fires, and rising sea levels. And so it's in the interest of the WTO and the global trading system to build economies that are more resilient and more adaptive to the increasing and accelerating impacts of climate change. The other part of it is, what can the WTO do? And I'm sure we can come back to this. So I wanted, in the interest of time, just to identify 4 areas. So the first is subsidies. There's a discussion underway next door on the role of fossil fuel subsidies. This has been in discussion in the WTO now for 20 years. It's been in discussion in the OECD, in the International Monetary Fund. You mentioned externalities. The estimated annual allocation of subsidies to the fossil fuel sector is about $450 billion a year. The IMF said, if you look at it from the context of externalities, the real cost of those, and this is the International Monetary Fund, it's not a think tank, it's not Greenpeace, their estimate is $5 trillion in externality costs of those expenditures on supporting fossil fuels. So, you know, for the trading system to step up and say we can do something with the disciplines in SCM is something that we're looking forward to, and the agreement of US, Mexico, and Canada that was released 24 hours ago, there is a provision for conditioning subsidies for fisheries, which is very welcome. So if they can do it, the WTO should be able to do it as well. The second is environmental goods and services. I think, as we've just heard from the ambassador from France, the expenditures on clean energy systems are last year $330 billion. There's more money going into renewable energy than there is going into the conventional energy sources. There's more jobs being created, 10 million new jobs from renewable energy. Can the WTO do something in carving out practically either from a multilateral or plurilateral context, a group of goods and services which are of export and production interest both to developed and developing country members. The third is pricing, taxes, and border tax adjustment. And this is, again, a discussion that's been underway in the WTO now for 20 years on border tax adjustment. It raises questions of like products and process and production methods. The other thing I would say is, for any economist, when you ask what is the first best or most optimal way in order to address greenhouse gas emissions, it's from using fiscal policy and pricing. So today, according to the World Bank, 88 different jurisdictions are using or are contemplating using different carbon pricing approaches, and they're non-compatible, both in stringency and in design. And so this question of border tax adjustment, I think, will inevitably come to the WTO. It'd be useful for the rules to get ahead of a case. And the last one I'll just mention is green procurement. And just to say that for many jurisdictions now, a part of their Paris commitments is to drive procurement towards clean energy, low carbon pathways. And one immediate example is the European Commission in May 2018 introduced a new provision that 25% of all expenditures, including procurement, will be directed towards clean energy and decarbonization activities. And so these are things that are moving almost daily post-Paris. And I think for the health of the WTO, as well as getting policy coherence, we need now to look at these systematic linkages. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vaughan, for highlighting the need for policy coherence among those 4 pillars. I'd like to turn to Claire Tutenui, and I'd like to ask, are exporting firms in developed countries already impacted by climate change policies and signals?
Yes, it works, yes. Yes, actually, they are impacted already by price signals. Even if the ETS price is still very moderate, it is obvious that a number of semi-finished products, I'm not talking about very sophisticated products, the problem of carbon pricing policies is really more acute for products like steel, cement, oil products, gasoline and so on, refined products, petrochemicals that have actually emission intensive, and where if you start to put a carbon price on it, have a very important effect, 10%, 20% on the price of the good. So it is not a very huge market, but it's extremely important to decarbonation, because precisely refineries, steel making, chemicals, aluminum, metals are really the industries where you have massive emissions. You have 2 tons of CO2 emitted for each ton of steel, for example. And so that's where free trade is actually an obstacle to the road to low carbon economy, is that also for more than 20 years, all economists have said that carbon price is a must if you want to decarbonize an economy, because you have first, you need to support some investment in new technologies. German chemical companies, for example, are working on processes of how to turn CO2 into something useful like hydrogen or CH4 or methane. They cannot do this unless there is a price signal that is actually making this hydrogen competitive with other technologies. Same for several others, substitution of metals with some other things and so on. So first thing is investment. The second thing is a demand. The consumer should use products that are lighter because they are less heavy in carbon as well. And so carbon price is needed by all sectors that are actually important to decarbonation. This is why in 2015, a number of business networks with ICC in the first rank, but also WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, of which EP is a French partner, for those who don't know us, have expressed a very strong message to governments ahead of the climate agreement. And this message was of importance is that, yes, it is possible to continue growth with a low carbon economy in the world, not just in, but there are conditions for this. And the first condition, is that it is not growth for every sector. Obviously, the fossil fuel sector will not know the same growth as the renewable energy sector, as you can imagine. So it is growth in general with transitions. And the second thing is that we need a carbon price, and we need a carbon price provided it is not just moving emissions here and there. So the problem is, as you explained, how to make compatible climate and trade. And there are actually, if you are a government or a region with a carbon price, and you wonder how to avoid this carbon leakage problem, there are 2 ways to do. You put some sort of a border mechanism, sophisticated as it is, or limited, and then you wait, it is attacked, and you wait for 10 years to have a decision by the organe de règlement des différends, sorry. And even if you have a positive confirmation by then, you have lost your industry. So this is not the way that anybody has selected. So they have all selected the second way, which is to put a zero carbon price for every good or services that is either exported or imported. Imported, it is obvious, but also exported. So since 20% of the world economy is moving from one country to another, at least, then you have basically a zero carbon price on the world economy, because nobody wants to have a real carbon price to be competed against by something coming from the outside world. So that's where trade is actually adverse to climate solutions, and where actually you see already that Europe, even with a low carbon price, is impacted, because there are a lot of cement plants in Ukraine, in Tunisia, in Morocco, and Turkey, and same with refining, a lot of petrochemicals from Middle East. So you have, it's not that it is carbon leakage, but it's just that it is new investments are not made in Europe, for example. So that's really a problem, is that getting this zero carbon price in the world economy is not compatible with low carbon growth that we know would be possible otherwise.
Thank you very much, Claire. And of course, we hate to admit that free trade might be an obstacle to anything, but I certainly heard you saying that there's a need for a carbon price and for a global carbon price if possible, and if not, discussions around border adjustments and other measures would be necessary. I'd like to turn now to my neighbor on my right-hand side, to Francisca Vieira, and to give us an entirely different perspective from an emerging economy, and you operate in the agricultural sector, and obviously growing cotton in 2018 faces a certain challenge, and a dual challenge, I may say, with climate change. On the one hand, there are scarce water resources, drought obviously affecting some cotton-producing countries, and which may lead to favor less water-intensive crops and alternatives. On the other hand, of course, we all know that in the cotton value chain, most of the emissions are actually produced in the later stages of transformation and consumption, which themselves may be impacted by carbon reduction policies. So have you actually felt this impact in the production of organic cotton in Brazil? And if so, how? And my second question would be, if so, how is the industry adapting, particularly in the export sector?
Okay, thank you. Desculpem, vou...
So I would ask you to be a bit I'll be speaking Portuguese.
O setor de moda é o que eu conheço bem.
The work I do is to transform the clothing sector. It's the second most polluting in the world. There are various statistics. Whether it's the second, third, or fifth most polluting sector in the world doesn't matter. The fact is that fashion pollutes, and we're in the cotton sector. I come from a region where there isn't very much pollution, but we're seeing climate change. It's raining less and less every year, and with respect to the cotton we produce, cotton doesn't need so much water, and we were able to save over 80% of water used in cotton production. We harvest cotton during periods of the year when it's not raining. It's drought resistant. It grows with a total of 120 milliliters of water, which is not very much at all. I'm not saying that I hold the absolute truth, but what I can tell you is that it is possible to see the fashion sector as something that's not all that polluting.
Começarmos a adaptar a indústria da moda nessas regiões, com o algodão, que nós sabemos que o algodão é matéria-prima de mais de 50% dos produtos de moda e vestuário hoje em dia. E se nós não começarmos a repensar no algodão que seja produzido com menos água, nós começamos a ter problema com essa matéria-prima, como nós já temos com outras que basicamente no Brasil foram extintas, como a seda está quase acabando e o rami, que é outra fibra natural, já se acabou, foi extinto. Então, trabalhar com com esse algodão também tem uma outra vantagem na minha região. Toda a nossa cadeia produtiva, ela é...
A cadeia produtiva. The supply chain is done in 120 kilometers diameter, and the production is around 120 kilometers from where it's make the yarn and the fabric and the textile. There is, in this sense, a kind of small footprint in the carbon in the whole process. I hope I was clear, and I believe we are going to have space for some questions, and I hope I can translate them, the cotton industry from Brazil, for you. This is a small chain, supply chain, and unfortunately the own country, Brazil, and the state where is that placed, they don't see the relevance of the supply chain. So that's why the business group has to bring this contribution, and they have to work without any financial support from the government and just with few support from some institutions in the country.
Intervention, what I take from what you said is that the fashion industry needs to adapt to climate change, and certainly a way of doing so is to use more drought-resistant seeds, more drought-resistant organic cotton, but also to look at vicinity of production centers. I now would like to turn to Ambassador Van Huykelen. You are a seasoned trade negotiator, and I have a naive question. Why is it that the WTO agenda is seemingly silent on the Paris Agreement and more generally, I dare say, on the issue of climate change?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I agree with you that more could be done, more should be done, but it's not altogether true that nothing has been done. Let me perhaps, first of all, say what has been done, and then secondly, perhaps say a few words as to why I believe not more has been done until now. I mean, it's clear that climate change is one of the most, it's a copybook example of a global problem. It's a problem that requires global answers, and given that the WTO has the ambition to be a global organization, it should have a role to play. It was already mentioned that the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement, which is in a way our constituent text, mentions the issue of making optimal use of the world's resources. So clearly, environment and climate change belong to the perimeter of the work of the WTO. What has happened on this issue so far in this organization? I think in terms of rule-making, basically nothing. However, there have been a number of rulings of the dispute settlement system, and notably the appellate body, that have clarified a few important issues, for instance, with regard to the Article 20 as concerns the environment, and then in particular with regard to the promotion of renewable energy. There have been a number of cases that have addressed the question of the use of subsidies and local content requirements, and to what extent they are consistent with the rules of our agreement, notably that of the ASCM, but also TRIMS and the TBT agreement or the anti-dumping agreement. I mean, there have been a few cases that are now quite well known by the practitioners of international trade law and international environmental law, such as the Canada feed-in tariffs, the Indian solar cells, EU biodiesel. These are cases that have addressed aspects of the question of trade and climate change. The main action with regard to rulemaking has been plurilateral. There was a mandate in the Doha Agreement, but it didn't get very far. And then we started a plurilateral, which was the Environmental Goods Agreement. there the idea was, let us make a positive contribution by facilitating the diffusion of environmental technologies through cuts, basically to zero, of environmental goods. The question was then always, what is an environmental good? There have been long and learned discussions on that, but in the end, an environmental good is that which 20 countries agree on. That is an environmental good. We went far. We were in this room, in this very room, in the wee hours of a weekend, but in the end we failed. December 2016. Since then, nothing has happened. The files are gathering dust. And we hope that sooner or later the main protagonist will say, let's have another stab. The European Union is obviously willing to do so. We will be there tomorrow. But, of course, the major players have to engage as well. Then, of course, there are plenty of discussions in the committees, in the Committee on Trade and Environment, in the TBT Committee, in the GPA Committee, where very regularly the issues of trade and climate change are mentioned and worked on. I mean, there's this issue of the voluntary sustainability standards in TBT. There is the discussion on green procurement in GPA. Now, given that time is short, let me then get to the question, why not more until now? And there perhaps I should put off my cap as an ambassador and put on another cap, that of an interested observer. I think there are, in a way, three reasons why we haven't done much. The first is, obviously these are separate worlds. You have the WTO and the UNFCCC. And I understand that people who work hard on mitigating climate change want other organizations to play their part. But on the other hand, the WTO can never substitute for any deal on climate in the organizations that are meant to do that. I agree fully with my neighbor when she says that we should definitely put a price on carbon. I used to be the chief economist of the Environment Department of the Commission, so I know a thing or two about this. But this issue of internalizing externalities is not something that a WTO decides on. That is something that the UNFCCC has to decide on. And then they perhaps can give us a task in the WTO to articulate that. That's precisely what has happened in fisheries, where the FAO and others and the world government or the world government leaders through the SDG have given a task as a subcontractor to the WTO, now work out solutions on fisheries subsidies. But we cannot substitute for the UNFCCC. If the UNFCCC decides that henceforth we are going to put a price on carbon, well, then perhaps we can run with that ball. But unless and until that has not been decided, it's extremely hard for this organization to do it. Two, let us also not forget that the issues are very complex and politically extremely fraught. I don't need to tell you that as soon as you start talking about these things, I'm not going to mention any names, there will be quite a few who will say, this is green protectionism. This is green protectionism, right? So let us not think that this is going to be a walk in the park. In addition, the issues are complex. I mean, the European Union has opted for an emissions trading scheme, which basically puts a price or charges producers, not products, producers. If you want to do that globally, then you would need to have a global ETS system. I think the European Union would be interested in discussing globalizing globalizing emission trading schemes, but we're not there yet. Similarly, if you were to opt for the other thing, which is a carbon tax, which is on a product and not on the producer, yes, indeed, interesting proposition, But given the global value chains, determining what is the carbon content of a product is not easy at all, and you will have, I think, very difficult discussions on how you quantify the carbon contact of, say, a plastic duck that comes into your bathtub. I mean, these sorts of things will require a lot of calculation work and will definitely require a lot of negotiation. But again, I think that the WTO, if it wants to live up to its ambition to contribute to sustainability, will have to improve its game on trade and climate change.
Thank you very much. We certainly heard you that a lot has already been done, and I shouldn't have said nothing has been done under the WTO framework. Certainly you also mentioned that UNFCCC ought to take the lead on establishing a pricing level on externalities, and then one had to be wary of issues related to green protectionism being raised. You also referred to a potential globalization of an ETS and of carbon tax, and more generally speaking, of the need to have an adequate carbon price. And perhaps later Claire can give us an indication of what she feels an adequate carbon price could be. I'd like to turn again to Scott Vaughan. What would be the elements of a win-win strategy that would positively combine trade growth and an overall reduction of carbon emissions?
Well, that's a big question. But I think one of the specific issues, and the ambassador has reminded us that Paris and the UNFCCC agreement is not on track to get to the target agreed in Paris of well below 2 degrees Celsius. So we know this now from every calculation on a rising greenhouse gas emissions. 2017, they rose again. So we're not there, and we're not getting there. And clearly one of the impediments is because countries are worried about development, livelihoods, and GDP. So this issue of competitiveness is really at the heart of why we're still seeing that growing gap between the urgency to move and the reluctance of either interests within countries on the fear of what will happen. So what I wanted to do is just give a couple of three quick examples. So the first one, when we think about competitiveness impacts of climate action, I think it's really important also to think about what is going to be the competitiveness impacts of inaction at the country level. And so again, just to remind us that we're seeing now almost daily the projected impacts of climate change or increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events, prolonged drought, prolonged flooding, forest fires, etc. And those are hitting livelihoods in the most vulnerable countries in the world in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries and other sectors. So this cost of inaction is now something that I think we have to take in on looking at externalities. But in terms of just a couple of examples of countries or jurisdictions that have taken action on climate, and the ambassador mentioned carbon pricing, and so did our colleague from France. So I mentioned there's 88 jurisdictions which have carbon pricing. The highest in the world, the most stringent, is Sweden. Sweden has had a carbon tax now in place for 20 years. Sweden's GDP growth in 2017 was 5%. This is one of the highest income countries in the world. This is a country which has been able to say that there is no competitiveness drawdown from having an ambitious carbon price at the national level. Within my own country of Canada, and it's become now sort of a case study on how you look at the design. So when you're looking at any carbon or climate mitigation, design matters. and particularly those working on fiscal policy, the sequence, the stringency, the implementation, those households that are exposed, and the flanking measures, etc. British Columbia, within Canada, introduced now coming up on 10 years a carbon price. Their design, it was going to be carbon neutral. It was going to be revenue neutral. So with the introduction of a new carbon tax, there was other taxes that were withdrawn. British Columbia had among the highest rates of economic growth of any province within Canada. So that tax did not drag the economic growth. And so the last thing I'll mention, from an economic perspective, the OECD has done, and many others, NBER, the IMF, many economic journals, but the OECD in 2017 released a report called Investing in Climate, Investing in Growth. And their sort of central conclusion was, depending on the design, depending on the sequence, depending on looking at things like taking into account dead weight losses, et cetera, with the introduction of the climate pricing, their finding was ambitious climate taxation pricing policies there will if done properly, would contribute to a positive global GDP growth of 2.8%. So that's their finding based on a series of data and modeling. And the question is, I think, for those industries, which our colleague, and I'll end, those industries that are going to be losers, that will be affected by jobs, the energy-intensive trade-exposed sectors like steel, cement, aluminum, and others, then it's important in looking at that to be upfront about what are the job losses and then what are the options for looking at transition to other pathways.
Thank you very much. I understand that, I take from your intervention that ambitious pricing signals do not have to be detrimental to growth, and quite the contrary, they can foster growth. I'd like to turn again to Claire Tutnui. From a multinational business perspective, what kind of initiatives do you think they would want to see from WTO to actually champion win-win strategies between trade and climate change policies?
Well, I think this will be a very easy question, and I would like to turn it to you, Nicholas.
I'm just the moderator.
No, but I am certainly not allowed to speak for ICC nor for business, except with this strong message from the Business Climate Summit in 2015. But obviously, what you could imagine is some sort of a climate waiver in the dispute settlement appellate body that would at least give comfort to states if they start making a carbon club and a border mechanism, tax or not tax, for some products, that at least there will be a case that they can carry to the appellate body with some chance and some confidence that their system will be actually confirmed positive. So positive, acceptable. So I think that would be a very major progress. And this, I'm not just inventing this now. This has been several years of work by the ICTSD, by several think tanks, by the ICC Trade and Investment Commission, as well as with the ICC Environment and Energy Commission. And the review of various mechanisms have actually identified this climate waiver as at least something that could be possibly a way to a solution. So that's my short answer.
Thank you very much, Claire. And indeed, you highlighted the issue of a climate waiver. ICC had its board meeting last week in New York, and indeed, we adopted a resolution to investigate the practicality of a climate waiver, obviously bearing in mind the need to avoid its usage as a protective measure. I'd like to turn again to my neighbor, Francisca Vieira. And again, from your perspective in the northeast of Brazil, how do you see that trade discussions as well as carbon reduction policies could actually help your industry, the cotton industry, to even further adapt and become more climate-oriented? I know you touched upon that in your first intervention, but I'd like to prompt you more on this.
she understands that that in Brazil it's talked a lot about an example. What she's doing in the organic cotton is something that can be replicated, can be done in different states in Brazil, but also in different countries in relation to the reduction of the carbon in the production. It's also related to the region where we live, so it's really close to the Europe. It's a really low footprint in carbon, but even if it's close to Europe, the product I'm producing, it has to be, the product has to flew from the North Brazil to São Paulo in the middle of the country and then go back. This is around 6,000 kilometers that the product is flying over the country, because we don't have a local structure about maritime transportation. We have a difficult port in Pernambuco in northern Brazil, and the airport is in the São Paulo state from where the goods are flying to Europe. So from that, it's really clear the lack of compromise from the government in the logistics and in our country. It is to see in the Paris Agreement that Brazil signed as well. It was supposed to be implemented. This logistic was supposed to be implemented, where the north of Brazil should have some seaports, considering that the production should not go to the middle to the country and then go to Europe. So in this sense would be reduce a lot of carbon emissions. She hoped she was clear, and please ask if it was not.
Very clear. I think what you referred to is that your agricultural production actually has a low carbon footprint, but when you look at the overall value chain, including transportation, the lack of adequate infrastructure actually increases that footprint. And so it's not just at the production level that one needs to look for solutions, but throughout the value chain, and particularly at the level of transport and infrastructure. I'd like to turn again to Ambassador Van Huykelen. The European Union likes to portray itself as a sustainable development champion. Who wouldn't want to? And to a large extent, it is a truly pioneering continent. So how does the European Union actually walk the talk by promoting more of a green, sustainable and pro-climate agenda in trade policy, more generally speaking?
Thank you. It is true that we consider ourselves to be at the vanguard of the work on sustainable development. Definitely so since 2009, which is the latest, or which was the year in which we had our last constitutional change, which was the Lisbon Treaty. And the Lisbon Treaty clearly makes a nexus between trade and environmental policies. We're trying to pursue this nexus between trade and sustainable development / climate change through the three traditional channels: multilateral, bilateral, unilateral. Multilateral, I can be fairly brief, because that relates to this place. Obviously, the main subject with regard to sustainable development is finally getting to an agreement on fishery subsidies. This has been asked since 2001. We did not get very far, to put it politely, in Buenos Aires last year. We now have the task to land by December 2019, because that is what the heads of state and government have asked us to do, because they say, or it is said in that text, by 2020. I've also mentioned the environmental goods agreement, where we hope that talks can resume as soon as conditions allow. That was not only about tariffs, it was also about non-tariff barriers. We've also pushed the idea of liberalizing trade in services that serve a clear environmental purpose. And then we have our series of free trade agreements, which have, since 2009, since our free trade agreement with Korea, has systematically a trade and sustainable development chapter. In that chapter, we typically cover 4 or 5 subjects. The first is the facilitation of the uptake of environmental technologies by front-loading cuts in tariffs related to environmental goods, by promoting green procurement and similar measures. We've done that in our FTA with Singapore, with Vietnam, with Canada, with Japan and Mexico, and I'm certain that these chapters will also figure in the FTAs to come, notably with Australia and New Zealand. Those chapters also promote the adherence to and implementation of all multilateral environmental agreements, and those, of course, include the UNFCCC agreements, the Paris Agreement, the Kigali Agreement, or the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. So what we're saying in those Sustainable Development chapters is that we expect our partners to adhere to those agreements, and we are collaborating towards the effective implementation of those agreements. We also have a number of other sustainable development issues in those chapters, including things like illegal logging, forestry, and then the well-known subject of illegal, unreported, so IUU fishing. We have our own European legislation on that, and those who have been caught in the nets of that regulation will know what I'm talking about. There is also the general rule in those chapters that each of the parties maintains high level of domestic protection with regard to the environment and declares that it will not lower environmental standards for the purpose of attracting trade or investment. So these are the sort of things that we typically have in our trade and sustainable development chapters in the FTA. And every year we have a committee that monitors the implementation of the contents of those sustainable development chapters. Finally, we do a number of things unilaterally. And the most important instrument we have to that effect is called GSP+, where we give essentially zero tariff, so duty-free access to a number of countries that are not LDCs, that are developing countries, and therefore are not falling under the EBA. Those countries enjoy duty-free access to the European market, and there are right now about 17 or 18 countries in the list of GSP+, provided that they comply with a number of international agreements, including those with regard to the environment. So, for instance, the Kyoto Protocol and then the Paris Agreement. What we also have done is work on a number of issues with regard to the certification of natural resource-based products like biofuels. We have our FLECT, our action plan to address illegal logging. These are things that we do unilaterally, but that also contribute to sustainable development. So you see, what we're doing is a fairly rich set of things, both globally, then with partners, and on our own.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I really noted that you mentioned that the Lisbon Treaty very early on made a nexus between trade and sustainable development / climate change, and that certainly in any FTAs the European Commission is negotiating, there will be, and there are, trade and sustainable development related chapters. I'd just like to ask two more questions to the panel before I open the debate to the floor. My first one is for Claire on the actual level of CO2 pricing. I actually have a former career in carbon trading, and we certainly thought at the time that in 2018 the price would be way beyond 100 euros. Now we all know it crashed down to around 50 cents. It's back to around 20 euros now. What would be an adequate pricing level to provide the signals we want to see?
Well, I think you made the right prediction because Sweden has exceeded 100. So at least there is one country up there. It's a difficult question. It depends on technologies, it depends on countries, and so on. What I can tell you is that France is working on something called a notional, a virtual level of carbon. What should be the price so that France could achieve their target of carbon neutrality by 2050, since now this is the objective of the government. And these prices have to raise. I mean, what it means is how do you reduce emissions from local transportation, not only industry, of course, but also industry, everything. And the price is way beyond 100, way beyond 200, actually, by 2030. And so, obviously, when you on a liter of gasoline, 100 is about 20 cents. So it's not, it's something, but it is not really terrible. You have had worse with just the oil market. On the steel market, this is much worse because with a ton of steel at 600, 2 tons of CO2 for 1 ton steel. So this would be $400 for 1 ton of steel. And then obviously you are not competitive, you are out of the market. And if you take Sweden, for example, Sweden has a very successful steel industry. They have also a technical solution to monitor, to do something with CO2 that is produced by the steel industry, which would be to send it to the North Sea and put it in carbon capture and storage under the North Sea, where it would be captured for a long time. And the technical validity of this solution is, of course, being studied, but is very, very likely. But for this, you need at least 100. So you have to get to this kind of price levels for carbon pricing so that it can be really have this massive effect of the carbon neutrality that is actually embedded into the Paris Agreement. If you remember, the Paris Agreement is from humanity activity. Human activity should be actually offset by natural absorption by forests, oceans, but that's actually very, very little emissions that you have to get to. And you have to treat these emissions from industry. You have to get emissions from fossil fuel back to not quite zero, but close to. And you cannot do it without really changing technology. We are not talking 10% improvement. We are not talking 20% improvement. We are talking actually getting to zero emission, zero net emissions. And this can be done only with prices of carbon that are changing the technologies, allowing Swedish steel industry to continue to produce steel, because we will still need steel, and of course more industries than just this one. And so this is a kind, we are talking 100, 200 or more in terms of the price per ton CO2.
Thank you very much, Claire. For the sake of time, I'd now like to open the debate to questions from the floor. We have, I understand, till 20 past 3. Please raise your hands and identify yourselves, and if possible, also ask your question in a succinct manner, and also mention to whom you would like to ask it at the panel level. The gentleman at the far end.
Thank you. My name is Jürgen Knirsch. I work for Greenpeace, and I have a question for Ambassador van Heukelen. In the run-up to the Paris negotiations, there was an internal paper by the Commission saying that the word trade should be avoided in the final Paris agreement. And the WTO would be the right place to deal with trade and climate issues. I heard from you that nothing has happened on the WTO level regarding rulemaking. You only mentioned some trade disputes. So I would hear from you, what have the European Commission done at the WTO level to avoid climate change? Claire already mentioned that the possibility of climate waiver. There are different tools which are under discussion for years. So which one is the one European Commission like to have on the WTO level? It is a new GATT Article 20, which would also allow exemptions for climate change. Is this a climate waiver? Is this the end of fossil fuels? So what is the position of the European Commission on WTO level to do something to avoid climate change? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador van Heukelen.
As I tried to say in my first intervention, what we have been putting the emphasis on is the liberalization of goods trade that has a positive environmental impact. So our emphasis has been on the liberalization of environmental goods. That has been the main activity. As I said, we went pretty far. This was a negotiation that took a few years. In the end, in December 2016, we were close to a list, but in the end, the gaps between a number of protagonists, I'm not going to mention them, those of you who are specialized in the subject know what I'm talking about, the gaps were too big. We hope that we can resume that debate. Now, on this issue of rule making in a WTO, there is so far not really a debate on this matter that would allow a negotiation to start. I mean, we have discussions on these matters in the Committee on Trade and Environment, but I can tell you there is no consensus on this. Mm-hmm. There is none. So it is fairly futile to start submitting proposals if you know that they're not going to land anywhere. For instance, if I hear the waiver that would then apply to, or a sort of peace clause, that would apply to measures relating to climate change so that they cannot be taken to court. For a waiver, you need unanimity. That's 164 countries. It's all nice and well to say we need a waiver, but right now, in my humble opinion, we're not close to consensus there. So we need still to work on this. Again, I think the WTO could do its job, but for that you need more upstream work on these issues in the UNFCCC. We can be an excellent subcontractor. We can be an excellent subcontractor, but please give us first a contract. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that reality check, and again for calling on UNFCCC to provide the roadmap for many of the issues that are being discussed here today. Any additional questions from the floor? Yes, the gentleman there.
In the same sense, and if it's possible, I will speak French.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, but can I? Yeah. Si possible.
If I could speak French. Rudy Deleuve, President of the European Confederation of Trade Unions, the ETUC. I understand the position of the ambassador, but at the same time, Europe claims to be #1 in sustainable development, the framework for implementing the Paris Agreement, create quality jobs, but the roadmap nonetheless is the Paris Agreement on climate change that must be brought into line with or into dovetail with development. And Europe has an important role to play. And in the long term, we'll have to move towards quality jobs, quality services, quality products with the European label. And I think Europe should take the fore to develop its services and its industries. Thank you for that statement. I expect that was more a comment than a question. Other questions? The lady in the third down. Yes, Gabrielle Marceau. Legal Services of the WTO. I'm Canadian. And I have more a comment, which I hope will lead to another comment. If we talk about waivers, we are admitting that there is some infringement, some violation. That's the very basis of the waiver system. And personally speaking, I'm convinced that it's possible with the current rules, which could be further clarified or improved, but it is possible to do an awful lot with what we have in terms of climate change, including border tax adjustment and a whole series of other actions. What we need is a bit what Scott Vaughan has said. Think about the way we should be doing that, because there are ways of doing things that are contrary to the environment, are illegal, and there are other ways of acting, putting in border measures and border taxes, which could be quite compatible with WTO rules. And might I conclude by saying that all of this case law, because the European ambassador has mentioned it, the case law says that since there's a reference to sustainable development in the preamble to the WTO Charter, any legitimate action to protect the environment in the future would be acceptable. So the protection of the environment could be the basis of various regulations where the distinction must be a legitimate one. That's where the difficulty lies. Thank you. Thank you very much. I understand that you're talking about the putting in place of measures that are compatible with the role of the WTO. Who wants to reply? Claire? Thank you for that encouragement. I greatly welcome this offer of services. We talked about contracts, but it would be useful if it is possible, if it were possible, it would be a good idea that WTO produce a position to say how this could be done, because things are not explicit. There's a lot of uncertainty. The WTO is awaiting a contract with the UNFCCC. I'd mention another example, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, which has taken on the problem of the climate without the UNFCCC dealing with it. I'm not saying that there aren't governments, all governments that have been involved in this, but they've done substantive work without coordinating with the UNFCCC, and they've come up with the idea that the ICAO does have something to do in order to protect the climate. The WTO could do something similar, produce an interpretation, a roadmap which could help the entire world, the entire trade world, better to contribute to mastering the global climate without an agreement between the UNFCCC, which requires adoption on a unanimous basis, and perhaps WTO could do that at the initiative of some countries, propose a path which would follow its rules, which have become quite impenetrable, let's be honest, for the outside world. Thank you, Claire, for those comments. Any other questions? We've got about 10 minutes left. Yes, the gentleman at the back. Microphone, please.
Votre micro, pouvez-vous vous présenter également?
Could you also tell us who you are? Yes, I'm Gisin, in charge of Indusol France. Now, following the Paris agreements on climate change, France merged various regions. Now we've got 3 regions in France, and each region has its climate plan. Could the ambassador of France tell us how these are negotiated? Are they negotiated individually? Is it France as a whole that does the recognition? Yes, France recognizes that its regions have some freedom of maneuver in order to adapt its measures in favor of the climate. The Quai d'Orsay has appointed climate ambassadors to each regions. Each ambassador must work together to coordinate action at regional level and also work on cross-border action. There are regions in France that are not border areas, but there are many that are border areas, even the sea border, the ocean border, and they must coordinate action. And France, as a state, does encourage this type of cooperation, which promotes cross-border trade. Let's be honest, if you have a cross-border ecological environmental program, then you're promoting trade cross-border as well. France has delegated to its regions the possibility of negotiating its environmental regions. There are some synergies that have been set up in the last couple of years. Thank you very much for your question. Thank you very much, Ambassador. A question over there to the left, François Georges, ICC France. I understand that it's relatively difficult in the current context for the WTO to take into account the climate waiver. As you said, Ambassador, there would be a formal request from the UNFCCC. But since we have representatives of the French and Canadian governments before us, how in the framework of the CEPA could we not test this climate waiver and give a specific example as to how trade between France, or rather Europe and Canada, could highlight the need to reduce carbon emissions? Who wants to respond? Ambassador?
Bien sûr, dans le cadre de
Well, in the framework of CETA, we could, the Canadian-European Free Trade Agreement, we could have that conversation. We could try to promote the issue of climate change at WTO level, but the UNFCCC shouldn't give us a type of mandate to request a waiver. Each member of the organization can request a waiver. But to get the waiver, there's a requirement for unanimity. So everyone here could ask for a waiver to a rule of the House. But to get that waiver, you need the green light from 164 members, and I could guarantee you that's not an easy thing to do. Thank you, Ambassador, for that clarification on waivers. Any other questions? Yes, the lady here.
And I do work for an international organisation, but I'm probably speaking here in my personal capacity as a concerned global citizen. I would like to congratulate you on the immense achievement of an international accord. I don't think anybody is underestimating the difficulty of what you had to negotiate or deal with there. However, isn't there also a risk that we create a false sense of comfort that we have agreed to a 2-degree limit, because I don't think anybody told Mother Earth, and it might be the echo chamber that I'm in on Google and Facebook, but YouTube is filling up with Armageddon videos of at least 4 degrees rise, and the likely sea level projection is 3 meters by 2100, not 1 meter. So my concern is approaching this with business as usual mechanisms, as if this were a usual situation, is really not appropriate. We're firmly in crisis territory here, and we need a bit more of a concerted action. We're being encouraged to buy and consume, be good consumers, but not to think about the consequences of that. So I know that's a big commentary, but these international accords, is there not a sort of false sense of comfort that, it's going to stop at 2 degrees because we've decided it will?
Thank you very much for your question. Perhaps, Scott, a brief answer?
I think, I mean, I share your concern. I mean, just a couple of, you know, the United States government released their second interagency report on the risk to the U.S. as a whole, as well as the U.S. economy, and that brought in not only Environmental Protection Agency and Interior, but Agriculture, Energy, State Department, International Development. And indeed, these are the projections on rising global temperatures. We're close now to 1 degree. This isn't a model. This is just observed increases now. When I started at the UN Environment Program 25 years ago, the worst case scenarios coming out of the IPCC was 0.5 to the upper bound nightmare scenario was 1.5 degrees Celsius increase at the end of this century. So here we are today looking at passing 1 degree Celsius, and what the interagency report from the United States said is we're on path towards 2 or 3 or 4 degrees with inaction. So I think that, you know, the Director General of the WTO this morning said it's important for institutions to take a look at whether or not their rules or their constitution are getting out of step both with the risks as well as practices. And so one example, our colleague mentioned net zero carbon. Apple, which we don't have any partnership with, is now among the largest producers of renewable energy in the world. They have made a commitment that their global supply chain will be based on a circular economy model rather than using new materials and throwing away old ones, making use of those as a value to close the circle and to bring total emissions down to zero. From a climate perspective. So you're seeing this now every day, literally every day in markets where you're seeing innovation. And my worry for those of us who strongly believe in the importance of a rule-based multilateral trading system, that the WTO is becoming out of step and increasingly irrelevant to the urgency, which I think you've underscored.
Thank you, Scott. Monsieur l'Ambassadeur de France, vous aviez...
Ambassador of France, have you any comments to make? Well, it's time to round up, but might I just say in response that we're all concerned, and a good example of that comes from the major investment, adding on to what Maria said, major investment in measurement of climate change for the increase in oceans. Europe has developed the Copernicus system to measure variations in oceans throughout the world with an error of 1%. So that shows you how interested we are in knowing what's going on and how much the governments are investing. It's a budget that's been doubled this year so that the European Union and its member states know what's going on. We are concerned and we want to know what's going on. It's the starting point to be able to act properly.
Monsieur l'Ambassadeur,
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it's time to conclude. I was told that the mics will be cut off at 3:25. I wouldn't want to leave the room without thanking the panelists, Van Herkelen, Madame Tutini, Vieira, Mr. Vaughan, and the ambassadors for their participation. And thank you as well to the public, which has flagged very interesting questions. We could have continued for a long time. Thank you, and have a